I have looked at the way that Islam becomes politicized. And Islam, unfortunately, is a case in point of the limit of the scholarship of political science on religion. Most of the time, my colleagues look at the text. What did this Muslim leader have written about jihad or about democracy or secularism? And actually, this kind of writings doesn't reflect the reality of lived political Islam on the ground. So what I have found that if I want to understand how Islam becomes politicized, the belief doesn't really matter. What matters is the belonging. Give you a short example. If I say Turkey here, everybody will tell me this is the most secular Muslim country. So why do we have an Islamist party in charge now for almost 2 decades? Why did the secular Kemalist project didn't achieve the elimination of Islam as a political force? To start with, because the secular nation state built its political and national belonging as a Turkish community by intercepting or absorbing Islamic belonging. So if you go to Turkey and you ask people, who are you? They will tell you, I'm Turkish and Muslim and Turkish. And they will not think that you can be Jewish, Christian, atheist, Alevi, and Turk. And why is that? Not because of the so-called Islamic tradition that doesn't separate religion and politics. Actually, quite the opposite. In the Muslim Empire, you could be Greek Orthodox and member of the Muslim Empire. But in the Turkish national identity, I am Muslim and I am a national and I am a citizen. And this was built by the secular nation state. So this is this dimension, in my opinion, that counts if we want to look at the politicization of Islam. Because then if you look closely, the connection between political religious belonging is made, and what is at stake is the behaving in the public space. Look what the fights are about. It's about dress code, morality in public space, freedom of speech. These are all questions about the status of religious expression, of different religious and political expression in a space that has been defined as the Muslim space, even by the secular actors. So you see how differently you can look at religion without automatically looking at the ideas or the belief. Of course, you have to take this into account, but not as a primary entry. So the second limit, and I will finish on that, of the approach to religion by scholars of politics is about secularism. Because most of our concepts and theory have crystallized again the Western experience as variables, so to speak. If you say secularism, more or less people think separation of state and religion, privatization of religion, and decline of personal religiosity. On these 3 levels, scholars of religion, both sociologists and anthropologists, have done a huge work showing that first the 3 do not go together, and that you do not need to be separated institutionally to be privatized, and that to be separated doesn't guarantee that there is a decline of personal religiosity. But if you look at the concept and the theories in political science, we are still at this level. So what I'm trying to say is to convince my colleagues that it is important not to redo these studies, but to include them in their approach to religion and politics. So that's what we are trying to do at Birmingham, and it's a work in progress, and maybe we can keep you updated along the years. So I want to give the floor now to my first colleague, Andrew Davis, the director of the Cadbury Center at the University of Birmingham. Andrew, if you could also present yourself in the academic.
I'll do that. Thanks very much, everyone. It's great to be with you this afternoon. My name's Andrew Davis. I am reader in the public understanding of religion. And at the moment, for just a couple of months more, I'm the head of Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham, which is a great privilege to be. I'm a biblical scholar by profession. My PhD was on the ethics of the book of Isaiah. And I'm very interested in how the Bible shapes attitudes to religion and how it motivates people's choices, especially in the politics and the society areas. I grew up in the 1970s. I know I don't look old enough, but I did. And we had a prime minister who came into power in 1979 called Margaret Thatcher, who you may possibly have heard of. And one of the things she's most famous for saying is there's no such thing as society. Well, the Conservative Party these days believes there is such a thing as society, but it believes that that society is made up of individuals. And that's very much true in terms of how you understand the role of religion in the world from my particular perspective, speaking as a Conservative. It's possible now that we are starting to take religion seriously on a global level, but actually the individual impact of religion on people's lives needs to be measured and needs to be understood as a way by which religion can affect political decision-making broadly. Okay? People who are religious, especially if they're from conservative religious traditions, cling to those beliefs very passionately and very deeply. Religion is not something that people can switch on and off. It's not something you give mere intellectual assent to. If somebody is religious, very often that is their entire motivating force. The religion isn't something that just feeds into their broader thinking, but it's the lens through which they view everything. And the more conservative a religious perspective they adopt, then the more dominant, prominent, and sharply focused that lens is. Of course, the danger is that they reinforce those lenses even more by only talking to people who are like them. And the more we speak critically into that context, the more it reinforces their hostility towards liberal elites, such as academics. I happen to be a Pentecostal. I'm from an Assemblies of God background in the UK. And much of my own work engages with what I'll call, for the purposes of this paper, conservative Protestant Christianity. That's a community which you can probably most easily see and understand in the US, where it accounts for about 1 in 4 of the population. We're told that 81% of white evangelicals voted for President Trump. That's the highest percentage of evangelicals that have ever voted for any president. And it appears, on the basis of the data we've got at the moment, that that's largely on the basis of social ethics, particularly fears over religious freedom, but also deep hostility to abortion. But religion is clearly an important motivating factor in why they did vote that way, it seems, on the basis of the data already available. I first came to realise how important an understanding this is when we conducted a project in Birmingham on megachurches and social engagement. And time again, when we spoke to the church members who are involved in these projects, they said to us, we don't do this to get people to come to our church. We do it because we believe God loves them and we want to show that love to him. So why are we feeding the homeless, the hungry? Why are we caring for the homeless? Because they are human beings who God loves. It's a moral responsibility upon us. It wasn't fundamentally about conversion, but they saw the social challenges of their community through distinctive religious lenses. Now, to me as a scholar of religion, to me as a Pentecostal, that doesn't seem in the slightest surprising. It's exactly what I'd expect. But to the policymakers that we spoke to, it was clear that this didn't make sense to them. They'd been so schooled in a secularizing intellectual framework that they couldn't begin to understand what this looked like and why religion would be any sort of motivation. So let me say this bluntly and clearly then. We need to really appreciate that those who cling to a conservative religious ideal genuinely do that because they believe what they say. Whilst I'm talking of Christians, I think that's true of all faiths. They're not spinning, they're not repeating an empty party line just for political gain. Their commitment to their religion is absolute and non-negotiable because that's the framework through which they understand the world. So they really do believe with all their hearts that abortion is so wrong because it's a belief of God's commandment against killing, irrespective of any other entirely rational and reasonable arguments. Equally, they believe, contrastingly, that the death penalty is appropriate despite its inhumanity because the Bible says the soul that sins shall die. End of story. That's the framework by which they appropriate these issues. And they take their sacred texts seriously as well. So conservative Christians don't view Genesis as a myth of origins. They consider it to be historical fact. Same for the conquest narratives of Joshua. There's no question in their thinking that Jesus existed, and equally there's no question that he's going to return one day to rule the earth for 1,000 years. Okay? So whether they're right or wrong to think those is irrelevant. The long and short of it is they believe it, and they believe it passionately, and any questioning of that, any parodying of those attitudes is unhelpful in trying to get political traction with these kind of communities. So conservative Christian attitudes to global affairs are governed and motivated by what they believe the Bible has to say, and they believe it has plenty to say about the world today. And maybe that's never more obvious than in the context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So let me just, in about 3 minutes flat, summarize for you how I think the Bible has something to contribute to this issue. Where do Christians get their attitudes, or conservative Christians get their attitudes about Israel from? Well, they believe that the Bible tells them how they should react to this situation. A huge majority of conservative evangelical Christians believe it's their religious duty to stand with Israel, even if that means standing in opposition to Palestinian Christians. Right? And they do that because they understand the biblical narrative as saying, for starters, the Bible claims that Israel was specifically and directly given the land by God. So Genesis 15 verse 18 says, "On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, 'To your descendants I give this land.'" Excuse me, that little phrase, "I'm giving you this land," or "this land that you must possess," occurs time and time again in the earlier part of the Old Testament. The book of Joshua talks about quest to possess the land. It talks about the land of Israel as their inheritance. And actually, if you read the Bible very carefully, then the boundaries of the land that is given to Israel are even broader than the extended boundaries and the contested boundaries today. The conquest didn't take all the land that God had promised them. So in the conservative Christian narrative, the land was God's gift to the Israelites, and so it belongs to the Jews today, because the Jews must only be identified with the modern state of Israel, even though that's problematic. We don't have time to go into that one. So nobody can withdraw God's offer. It wasn't theirs to withdraw. God made it. We've got to stick to it. And even the present boundaries of the state of Israel are insufficient because God promised them more than this. Secondly, the land that they are given was not empty, but Israel was told by God to take the land from those who were already inhabiting it. So in Joshua, the Lord will drive out before you the Canaanites. The land was occupied when God gave it to Israel, and the biblical narrative says he gave it to them because of the wickedness of the various Canaanite tribes. Conservative Christians acknowledge this, and in fact, some of them have used that as an acknowledgement for taking possession of Palestinian homes and territories, their argument being that the Palestinians had no right to lay claim to what was always Israel's land anyway. Okay? Again, I'm not agreeing with that position, far from it. I'm just pointing out that's what they accept. And they also follow through on the logic of Israel being told to kill those in their own way. So you've probably heard the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. I haven't heard any prominent Christians advocating extermination of the Palestinians, but they certainly believe that this has to be taken seriously and that Israel's rights are prioritized over everybody else's. So let's just reflect on that very briefly, and then I'll skip to my conclusions. There's no sense of nuance or subtlety in the biblical interpretation here. They wrest these observations from their context, they apply them literally, and they suggest that the context which we find ourselves in today, even though it's entirely irrelevant to the biblical context, is something that the Bible has to speak into. Okay? The political implications of this tradition for the US follow, I think, in the fourth assertion, and that is the observation that the Bible says other nations are promised and commanded to bless Israel. Part of God's promise is that he will bless the nations that bless Israel. So conservative Christians argue not only should Israel be supported, defended and blessed because the Jews are God's chosen people, but also because standing with Israel is the key to the success and the well-being of their own nation. Let me just stick the conclusion slides up there for you. just so you can see what my conclusions are. Religion is part of the solution to this problem. It's not all of the solution, but to try and parody it and try and negotiate a resolution without taking account of the religious situation is massively problematic. The final three conclusions, I can't read over my shoulder, but you can see them behind me there. Okay, my time is gone. Thank you.
Thank you. So I pass the floor to Francis Davis.
Is this working here?
Yeah.
I'm going to stand up so I can figure out. Okay, it's brilliant to be here at the Berkley Centre. My name is Francis Davis. I'm Professor of Communities and Public Policy at the Cadbury Centre in Birmingham. In a previous life, I was the faith advisor to the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, which is like our Secretary of State for Housing and Urban Development, which is at that time was the clearinghouse for all faith questions through the UK government, a bit like the Office of Faith-Based and Community Services. My paper, which is a draft of the draft, which I was road testing at the International Studies Conversation, is on whether religious orders, or looking at religious orders again, can help us to understand the international system. Now, I'm aware, as a result of meetings this morning, that Jose Casanova has been working on the Jesuits as a globalizing force. I think I've approached the issue with a different emphasis, because if you look at orders, they tend to represent all sorts of stereotypes about the way that we see the world, but then we can unpack them in different ways. The top left-hand corner there is a member of the British province of Jesuits, shall we say, being visited by the South African Defence Force under apartheid. The bottom left-hand corner is just before Christmas, the current chaplain at Wits University, who'd been beaten up by the police for supporting striking students. The sisters here went for a swim on the beach in France last summer, not really realising there might be a bit of a tension with the burqa ban that was going on at the time, but no one bothered that they were on the beach, if that makes sense. Whilst young fella on the right here in the corner, member of the Franciscan Friars of Renewal, in the UK most recently, political impact of their internationalisation of a particular conception of Catholicism, invaded an abortion clinic, taking photos of those within the clinic and breaching all sorts of anonymity rules and triggering a serious incident through our health system. Different conceptions of religious order in context. Globally, even after the decline in some of the US orders, there are nearly 1 million members worldwide of orders, 850,000 lay associate members coming only from 4 order families. Of those, 3/4 are women. These are lived, conscious communities of prayers. They have their own governing documents, their own statutes, their own constitutions, they have their own internal political dynamics, referring not just to what would Jesus do, but what would St. Francis do, what would our founder, whoever our founder would do, and how do we then make that real and concrete through our constitutions. They carry chains of memory. They're not state, although many of them have net assets and bigger cash flows than states and multinational corporations. They're not really NGOs, and yet several of them have full-time NGO recognized status at the UN, and they carry and implement a whole series of contrasting strategies for innovation in the social sphere, humanitarianism, and the reverse. So this could be a gap in the study of IR, because international relations traditionally has been focused on states, and I want to suggest that it is because of that gap in states, that because international relations was dominated by the secularization thesis, we didn't pick up any of these religious organizations, but also there's been a kind of a pushback from particular approaches to Catholicism to having any frame of analysis applied to their institutions if it doesn't privilege the sacred science of theology. And just as a side to that, there's that famous study by Tom Rees at this university of the 350 US Catholic bishops that shows, despite a formal theology, a formal theory of organization of the Bishops' Conference, that the Holy Spirit will reveal and suggest to the nuncio who should be the next bishops. If you didn't go to the North American College, Catholic University of America up the road, or have a family linked to the Midwest, there's nothing that God can do to get you made, until recently, a bishop in the US. So, are these orders women's organizations and a missing strand within the history of the women's movement? 705,000 of the 900,000 members of orders globally are women. Mary Ward in AD 1617 launched in a socially entrepreneurial way a group of sisters known as the Institute for the Blessed Virgin Mary, saying that there is no such difference between men and women, that women may not do great things. Her order is now distributed to 60 countries, split between the two families of the Congregation of Jesus and the Loreto sisters, whose schools you will have encountered. Just recently, one of their alumni was chief of policy to our Conservative Prime Minister, and then the first woman on the board of a London Stock Exchange floated country. If you look at the history of healthcare, the contribution of women's orders, say in a country like Zambia, to the development of 80% of local hospitals is almost airbrushed out, which tells you both about the gendering of health histories written by doctors and their children or whatever, but also about the way that religious institutions then get focused out again. And of course, this is not an uncontested series of achievements. Some of those orders along the way may not have had social impacts, and others will have had trouble getting going in the first place. So one of the reasons why so many of the schools in Chicago were founded by women's religious orders wasn't because God appeared one night to the then Archbishop of Chicago and said, "Go forth, Sisters of Sacred Heart," or whoever, and multiply. It was because he did a better hourly rate for their teaching time with the sisters, because they were ladies, than he managed to do with the brothers up the road. So it was cheaper for him to bring more orders in from Ireland. So there's a kind of a division of labour thing going on there. So it's about conceivably the women's struggle. These are real organisations with real impacts and resources. The pooled revenue of the orders globally, even if you value it at $6 an hour, is about a £1 billion social equity investment per annum. The reality is that many of the sisters in the north have been paid market rates as nurses, teachers, and university faculty over the years and pooled those. That takes that in-kind contribution up. The net assets of just 3 orders here in the US, their educational institutions at higher education level, 20 billion. And Christian Brothers Services is investing 6 billion and is an activist investor. And the way that all of these economic relationships are dealt with by bankers is high viscosity, is the jargon that they use, high net worth clients. So they're treated in the same space as the Gateses and the other multimillionaire companies. So if we're analysing these institutions, they're not NGOs, they're not states. So do they have the same agency in the political system as high net worth or ultra high net worth innovators? And of course, they're striking innovators, but their theories of social change are profoundly different to the other kinds of agency that we try and analyse and make sense of our humanitarianisms through. A former Secretary of State in the UK sent a delegation seeking to learn about accountable care organisations to the US from our secular mainstream nationalised health system. They visited a network of the Franciscan sisters here with revenues of $8.5 billion a year, said, "What's your finding ethos and how do you make it work?" And half an hour later, the talk about the ethos of Francis, the expression of God's face, God's love in the face of the patients, was complete, and the secular decision makers were completely confused, went away saying there was nothing to learn from this hyper innovative, impact creating, successful hospital system. Again and again, across the planet, the orders are great social innovators, with the Jesuits most recently being awarded the prize for having created the world's most successful community radio station. Their governance, character, politics are distinctive. The Dominicans, so democratic that sometimes they will spend their time in decision-making for so long that they can't grow organizations at scale. The Jesuits, by contrast, more centralized, founded by a soldier. The Franciscans, originally founded with no rules or statutes, took until the late 19th century to be able to put in place governance structures that enable them to make decisions. In what way have those competing conceptions of internal governments and hyper-democratic cultures shaped the social impacts, the civic contributions, and the political strategies that they've used, for example, when going to advocate at the UN or at national government places? Religious orders then, between, within, both religious and faith-based, both founded from a shared Christian conception, but as various in their ways of working as there are varieties of trade unions and there are firms, as big as multinational corporations, as politically active as some of the big foundations like Heritage and the National Endowment for Democracy. Seems to me it's a big gap, and we need to flush it out between NGO and the state to understand a part of the global system that's been with us for centuries, but we've not yet thought about adequately. Thanks for listening.
Typically time. Oh, no, I'll be fine. Yeah, because otherwise I have to keep backing with it. All right. Yeah. So I'm going to break with the tradition that my previous two presenters have set up for you by not having a PowerPoint. I spent the previous 8 years working alongside the military, and as a result of that, I'm PowerPointed out. Yes, so whenever I have the opportunity to be relieved of PowerPoint, I'm afraid I liberally do so. Now, my paper presents to you a 3-part framework. And the basic hypothesis of my framework is that scholars of religion and of global politics actually have a lot to learn from the experiences of feminists studying international relations and the way in which gender has been approached to the study of international relations. Now, I originally started out writing this paper simply to say, in understanding Daesh and the Islamic State, we kind of need to recognize that religion matters. But that phrase, religion matters, just resonated with me with some of these ideas that gender matters. And so I started thinking through the experiences of feminism within international relations and what is it that scholars of religion and scholars of IR can learn and in order to better understand some of these phenomena that we're experiencing today. Because I kind of figured we don't need to repeat 30 years worth of understanding. We can kind of skip through some of that. So in this 3-partite way of demolishing Daesh, shall we say, I present to you 3 ways in which we can begin to understand the category called religion. The first is as a variable, i.e. simply another unit of analysis. The second is that we can understand religion as constitutive, i.e. it actually makes up something that frames and understands global politics. And then thirdly, that religion can be seen of as transformative. Now, those of you that have studied feminism and IR will recognize that 3-partite system from Jill Steen's book back actually in the 1990s. So we can go and study beyond or backwards from 911. Now, the reason I think it's really important that we actually take seriously this category of religion is that in my studies of security studies and within the military and working with terrorism, all people seemed to be concerned about was the output. What does religion do? I.e. the output, the consequence of this thing called religion. They weren't really that fussed about what happened inside the black box known as religion. You have A phenomena, then you have religion, A plus B, and all they were really concerned about was A and C, the outcome. Whether that outcome was peace or whether that outcome was violence, and there was often that binary. So in addition to that, what you then found when you start looking at how do IR scholars treat religion is it tended to be supplanted for something else. Rather than treating religion as a category in and of its own right, instead what we find is that religion got treated as a proxy variable. So it got treated as a variable, an equivalent of community. So it simply became like another ethnic group. It was a religious group, it became a religious community, because in IR we knew what that meant. We know what a community is. Or it became transplanted as yet another part of one's identity. So we have a religious identity. But really, what the religious component of that didn't really matter. It could have been just another variable, another component. Or it can be seen simply as ideology, right? A voile, propaganda even, right? So religion is not taken seriously because it's merely seen as something that elites do to disingenuously mobilize the masses. So again, it gets to be not taken on its own terms. And I think this speaks to Andrew's paper, where he was saying, actually, we need to take seriously the claims religious people make in and of themselves, rather than displacing them and saying, this is merely ideology, this is just how elites mobilize. Now, to be fair, elites do mobilize using religious language. There's something incredibly powerful about God says. Once God says, there's not much arguing that can be done. But nevertheless, this idea that we can just treat religion as another category, as something else, rather than looking at it seriously, is really where my work comes from. So, if we're to take religion as a category of analysis, then we can do some nice, neat things. If we take it seriously as a variable, we can simply say, well, where is religion? Where are the religious folk? in the same way that feminists asked, where are the women? And I would argue, much like Talal Asad and Elizabeth Hurd, that religion has actually always been there if we choose to see it, right? It had been cast out of IR in much the same way that women were cast out of global politics. But they were really there. We just chose not to apply our lens and look at them. And this actually talks to Francis's paper. Those global orders have been there for centuries. We have just chosen not to see them. So in a way, what I'm asking is perhaps we should actually take seriously and look at the religious groups. Now, you might find this a slightly odd thing to do in the case of Daesh, right? It's a religious organization, or is it, right? Again, if you look at the discussion in international relations around Islamic State, what it tends to get boiled down to is either it's religious and therefore represents all Islam, or it's not religious and therefore has nothing to do with Islam at all. And it's presented as a binary, right? We don't actually get to take seriously the religious claims made by their members, right? We get to say they're not really religious at all. We're not allowed, in a way, to acknowledge that some of them, and we can disagree with their religious motivations, do see this as a religious obligation. And the way in which Islamic State do this then makes it very interesting. So we can actually look at the way in which Islamic State cast their religious call, and they speak to a globalized, a globalized ummah, right? They make this a global obligation for all religious Muslims, right? That's their claim. And we can dispute that. We can unpack what the ummah is. But then when you look at who actually qualifies as part of that global call, if you join Islamic State, what kinds of Muslims actually count? Who is allowed to be part of their membership? And suddenly you find it's a very reified, very narrow, very, very precise set of people who get to be qualified as religious according to them. And I think that is actually a fracturing in their language, it's a fracturing in their organization, it's a weakness, and it's something that if you were wishing to exploit, you could easily do so. Because on the one hand, they're claiming all Muslims, and then when you get there, you find out it's a very, very narrow band of who counts as religious. My second part, then, is to turn around and say, okay, so if we look for the religion, and if we acknowledge that religion is there, how is religion constituted? How is religion made up? How can we begin to understand it? And how does it make global politics, right? How do the two feed into each other? And I would say that actually what's quite interesting, again, is if we look at Daesh's understanding of the caliphate, there is a temptation within IR to treat Islamic State's claims about being a caliphate as simply another form of state. It's just a state. It's a state in being, a nascent state, a weak state, a tyrannical state. But we supplant their language with our own. But actually, in order to understand Daesh's politics, we have to go back to their theology. We have to begin to understand how and what they mean by a caliphate and where they get those terms from. What kind of history do they talk to? And how is that different to the Westphalian history that so much shapes our understanding? Now, for the purposes of timing, I'm not going to go into that too much, but one of the really key things that I think is important for us to understand, again, if we're trying to unpack and perhaps present holes in what they're doing and saying, there is a considerable degree of irony when you read through Daesh's claims about a caliphate, that in order to remake the caliphate, they also have to destroy the gift that God gave them, i.e. this earth. Violence becomes cosmic through their understanding of the apocalypse and the caliphate, and the two operate in tension. This is not just violence to create a state. This is not just there is a management of savagery, to use one of their texts, but actually their argument is, and it's an ironic one, that they have to destroy this place, this temporal order, in order to, which God created for his pleasure. There's a contradiction there, a paradox. To please God, you have to undo all of his good work. Well done. I say that with British irony, sorry. I know that doesn't always translate so well.
Can you check the time?
Again, I'm doing all right for time. Yep, I have a minute. Okay, and my final part then in all of this is irony of my own. Because if we're to follow this story of feminism in IR, where they start off looking at gender as a variable, so where are all the women, and then you think about how is gender constitutive of IR, so what are the terms that we use and how are they gendered, so now I'm looking at how are they theological. The third part in feminism in IR is the postmodernist strand, where they then turn around and say, well, it's all very well, but maybe this very category gender needs to be unpacked. How is that created? How is that formulated, right? So you end up saying that in a way, and there's a quote here from Anne Sitnow, women became a homogeneous identity to fight the way that women have been relegated to the homogeneous category woman. We can apply this so too to Islam in some ways. We can turn around and say that Muslims become a homogeneous identity to fight the way that Muslims have been relegated to that homogeneous category woman, right? And perhaps we also need to unpack how it is these ideas of what is religion actually get constructed in global politics, right? Because any scholar of Islam or of religion will recognize the diversity within that tradition, that it is not a singular narrative, that there isn't one history or one way of being Muslim. There are, what was the phrase Peter Mandeville said? He said there were as many ways of being of Islam as there are Muslims on the world, right? So it's a diverse tradition. And I would argue in conclusion that in order to do religion in global politics, or in order to do religiously sensitive analysis in global politics, we actually also need to deconstruct this category, religion, which is where Justin and I have some interesting discussions about how we go about doing that. What does that mean? What does it look like? Where are the boundaries of it? But I really think that taking religion seriously in and of its own terms can be really productive in our understanding of global politics, as well as the particular phenomena. And I'd like to thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Catherine. So we have a good 40 minutes for Q&A. So the floor is yours. Yes, please introduce yourself to.
Chris Estrada with the State Department. Fascinating, just to recognize that religion is actually a player in global politics. It's an achievement. How can we, well, let me backtrack. The whole concept of secular, I think, could be deconstructed as well, because from a religious perspective, secularism and humanism become religious ideologies. Secularism takes God out of the marketplace, out of the public square, and humanism elevates the human as God. And I think there's a dichotomy there, a dialogue, a dialectic that could also be explored, the whole relationship between secularism and religion.
Can I respond to that? Because that's first, the dichotomy between secular and religious come from the Western Christian history, okay? But it has also been embedded into the Westphalian order, and secular realm is a domain of international relations. So we know now from the work of sociologists of religion that actually secular and religious have always been intertwined. If you look at secularism, that's why the terminology is important here. Secularism is not a concept on like it wants to be presented. It's an ideology. It's an ideology that goes with the idea that separation of church and state, privatization of religious expression, and decline of personal religiosity are the way to go for everybody. Right? The reality is, if you distinguish, and maybe that's where I should have finally a slide or a PowerPoint, you have the institutional level, not of secularism, but secularization, an ongoing process where the state and the religious organization interact in different ways. And separation is maybe not the only way. The French and the American are the only ones separating, if I am not mistaken. But in England, there is an Anglican church, but it's still secular at the institutional level because other religious groups are recognized. India doesn't separate. but the Indian state tried to be equidistant to all other religions. So already you have to unpack this level of institution. And unfortunately, the political scientists tend to stay there, thinking that if they have captured the level of institutional relation between state and religious organization, they can understand the social and the personal. But unfortunately, no. Then you have the social level, where, again, America and the US are a good example. They supposedly separate, but the level of social legitimacy of religion in both spaces is completely different. So you see, what are we talking about here? Again, you need to unpack, and I'm not inventing that. I'm just using the work of people like Connolly, like Charles Taylor, Jose Casanova here, in the work I'm doing in political science. I do not need to reinvent that, you see? And if we look at the personal level, it's the same thing. Do we really witness a decline of personal religiosity? Is it just a rearrangement of identifying to your tradition or observing the prescription? There are lots of things here by anthropologists of religion that we tend to forget. So it becomes more complicated, and as Catherine said, it cannot be variable-centered. The problem in our discipline in political science, we tend to identify variable A and how it influences the dependent variable B. Doesn't work this way. You need to introduce history, and you need to introduce context. And it's off the framework of political science as it is now in the US and in policymaking too. I'm sorry.
Sorry. It becomes very interesting when you have a Western world order international community trying to establish democracy in the Islamic State of Afghanistan.
Yeah, exactly. Having talked to lots of people who are in the military in Afghanistan, you know, are you going to say to the Afghan, you're going to have to separate Islam and the state? It's not going to work. But if you have other model like the Indian model or the Indonesian model, you can discuss how the state maintains Islam, or the Anglican model, but recognize the other variable or the other existing group. You see, that's where the comparison and the understanding outside America is very important.
I just
Yes.
Yeah. So, is this working? No?
Yes, it should.
So just to add to that, so I mean, if you're sitting in the State Department, I think one of the things that it picks up something that Catherine said about you can decode what you're encountering. So someone comes in to see the Secretary of State, you decode it as an institution. It's called Catholic Relief Services. And I'm going to use Catholic examples because I think we always end up with case studies which kind of default back to those that have a choice of political violence as a strategy. It's about the analytical category. So there is a contested domain, say, between Catholics and evangelicals and conservative Catholics and other kinds of Catholics as to what the humanitarianism is. So some evangelical parachurch agencies, an evangelical NGO and relief agency, will be condemned by local congregations, Pentecostal or evangelical congregations, for decoupling the social action from the worship into a parachurch agency called Lutheran World Relief or whatever, and therefore making it more secular. But when you encounter it, when they come to visit you, by God, they're very godly when they walk in through the door. Yeah, but in their own dynamic, they're dealing with something else. And this plays out across into the Catholic case because at State Department or at USAID, you might be very familiar with Catholic Relief Services, which is part of the global Caritas International Federation, which has revenues of about 4 billion, has about 1 million people on the ground globally, and would consider itself to be part of the Ministry of Social Affairs of the Church. But when you meet them, this isn't an outsourced secular body. This is, in their theory of organization in the Catholic Church, fully part of the church as much of the congregation, but smaller than the religious orders, who some people might meet for the first time and meet a nun with a habit on and think that they're meeting something much more religious than the in-the-face feminist that walked in the door from the Catholic Relief Services. And so even within the experience of what's secular, there might be different contestations going on within these groups. And if you can't read those, one might not be able to interpret whether they're a good person, good agency to allocate cash to because of the kinds of arguments they're having internally. We know about the chaos inside Amnesty International but we don't do that analysis inside the Caritas Federation. We know about different kinds of trade union, but we don't do that analysis for religious orders. And that's partly because we kind of think that's the same, but also we don't recognize that they're all calling each other secular, even though they look very godly to the rest of us from the policy community.
Yes, please, in the back.
Hi, my name is Ken Dante, and I worked as a therapist, so I relate to a lot of the psychological that have been mentioned. Just to thread into what Catherine said, just thinking about the effect of trauma and severe trauma to cultures, and even how religion has played into that. A lot of what I see in religion are certain traumatic effects, like I think of St. John and the Apocalypse. What happens at the end of the world? Then the question is, can you bring the end of the world? And I think, I don't know if I have this correct, but it's the premillennialists that believe that you have to create this mess first and then you'll get the 1,000 years of blessing. That's in Christianity, but also how this plays out in Islam. And R.J. Lifton, he was a psychologist that worked a great deal with trauma, whether it was in China or after Hiroshima or the Nazi death camps. He talked about an apocalyptic mindedness. And basically, you had to destroy the world to save the world. And that was like a theme, I think, that you brought up. If you could expound on that more, or just even talk about the effects of traumatized populations and how they shift their belief and psyche based on their religion to a world that is falling apart.
Please, Catherine.
Okay, so actually there are some really interesting parallels with what Andrew said about land, because that apocalyptic vision happens in a particular place, and the recreation of spaces as sacred. So what you also see is not just the redefining of time, as in what is the present time. One of the biggest splits within various Islamist radical groups is when exactly will the Mahdi come, and when exactly will the Islamic State really come into existence. So various groups predict 2020. Others have it way out beyond that. And you can have a whole range of arguments in the same way that you have with Christianity, is what is your time scale? But actually place, to me, is one of the most important ways in which we begin to understand how trauma of a population within a place occurs. So again, without wishing to be too mawkish, should you have the misfortune of looking through a whole load of videos that IS put out, personally, I wouldn't recommend it. It's not good for your soul. It's not pleasant. But should you do so, one of the really interesting things, and things that often get overlooked, is the symbolism within those videos and in the actions that they carry out that are theological, not just political. And one of those is about the purification of the land. The demolition of sacred spaces that belong to other traditions is about the cleansing of the land. And it's about the eradication of other people's histories and other people's memories and other people's belonging to that space. And it is a very physical, real obliteration of those memories. But it is also more than that. It is actually also political. Because what that also does is it eradicates other spaces for politics. So within the Middle East, Sufi shrines and local pirs, local saints came up, and there will be lots of shrines in various villages all over. The demolition of those means that women don't have spaces to congregate. Those, and actually it's the same in Pakistan, those spaces were women's spaces. It's where women worshipped. And they would use the pirs, regardless of the Sunni faith, to intercede and use those spaces. And it was a very interesting way of generating local politics at the local scale. You eradicate those places, you eradicate those other forms of politics. Politics then gets intertwined with this particular caste of people who are allowed to do politics, a very particular elite of Sunni, or believe they would say Sunni, Wahhabi, we might say, group of men. And that becomes very interesting, because if you don't have your memory and your sense of space and your place and your connections, I think that can be very hard for populations to recover. And how do you live in a land where your memory and your history as a civilization has been taken away for you? And I think that ties in a bit with what Andrew was saying about sacred place as being a completely different geography, a completely different location. So our state map boundaries don't make sense anymore if you're actually talking about a sacred geography. But you can't ignore the state, right? And that's what Jocelyn's saying. we layering in these different histories, and for populations, then you get the question of identity. So it's a long-winded way of kind of saying, yeah, there are issues.
Andrew, do you want to say a few?
Yeah, so just to add, Christian eschatology, so the Christian understanding of what the end of the world looks like, is very much centered around land. It's very much centered around the destruction of various bits of land. And many of you have heard the kind of, maybe seen the film Armageddon, kind of, perhaps you didn't realize that's a biblical concept, at least arguably a kind of prophesied end time great battle where all the nations of the world are supposed to gather together in Israel. It's at least one reading of some of the biblical texts, but that's very much tied up with particular bits of the land of Israel. Also, there are conservative evangelical understandings of the kind of temple in Jerusalem being rebuilt. The kind of problem with that is, well, one of many problems with that is that the Temple Mount obviously is occupied by the Dome of the Rock at the moment. So that in itself, that particular eschatological understanding poses interreligious challenges, because there are conservative evangelical groups who think that the Dome of the Rock should be pulled down to make way for the new Jewish temple to be reinstated. So you can imagine in a kind of political hotbed such as Jerusalem, the kind of contribution that makes. So the connection between eschatology, the doctrine of the end times, and the kind of trauma that that will bring, and religion is a very complex and not a very pleasant one, I think.
Yeah.
For sure.
Please. Yes, introduce yourself for the radio.
Sure. Evan Berry from American University. Thanks, everybody, for your presentations. I appreciate it. My question is primarily to Andrew, but I welcome any comments from the panel. And I think it's about what you were just saying there at the end around the view of Christian groups about Israel. In your presentation, I sort of see the flow being from Christian beliefs into the sphere of politics around the question of the status of Israel and Palestine. And I want to ask about the reverse, which is to say, 150 years ago, Christian groups, especially Christian groups in Europe, had a very different set of views about the Jews, about the status of the Jewish people, about the end times, about the sort of the ownership of that particular piece of land. So clearly those views have changed, I'd say, on the whole. The question is sort of about how political contestation and political questions flow into the production and construction of religious beliefs, so that we can maybe think about that membrane between the religious and the political sphere being bidirectional. Thanks.
The kind of politics of 19th century Zionism are kind of beyond the kind of limits of my knowledge, I'm afraid. But I do know that there was a phenomenon in early Pentecostalism at the turn of the last century, something known as British Israelitism. I don't know if you come across that at all. The idea that Britain, probably England more than anybody, was the kind of focal point of the 10 lost tribes, and that kind of England was the kind of the focal point of what was going to happen in some of these ways. And if you ever read some of this kind of Christian eschatological understanding, especially in the popular narratives, very often it looks at some of the myths of the book of Ezekiel and Revelation and Daniel and things like that, and picks up on some of the animal metaphors. So there's a lion that's spoken about as possessing the wings of an eagle, which of course has to be the United Kingdom, with the wings of the eagle must be referring to the United States, because the eagle's wings are later removed from the lion, therefore that's the American independence, etc. So very often those kind of mythological narratives underpinning all of these things have been used for political means. So there's certainly a move in the early years of Pentecostalism to kind of reinforce a particular political narrative that underpins that. I think what happened with the establishment of the State of Israel fits into an eschatological narrative of Israel must be restored before the Messiah comes. So I think the original political motivation does come from a theological belief that not only must we bless Israel, but actually Israel's restoration is the precursor to these great end time events and the return of Christ. So yes, the politics is vitally important. I think a lot of that, from my understanding, has more to do with kind of popular Jewish culture in the late 19th century. I think the impetus in kind of conservative evangelicalism mainly comes from the political impact of the theological understanding.
If I can just one thing, I don't think the two annihilate each other. I think you still have a strong anti-Israeli sentiment that is not that is that is not. I mean, what Andrew, to say it in another way, it doesn't express the whole Christian or even evangelical. I don't know about that, but doesn't completely express the whole Christian position vis-à-vis Israel. Let's put it this way. There was
Just very
yes,
quickly.
yeah.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, I just two very quick points. Firstly, my understanding is it is a diplomatic priority of the State of Israel to reach out to, engage and inform discourses inside particular parts of the Christian community, from receptions to funding to scholarships to whatever. So I think you're onto something there. And then secondly, I did a 22-country study looking at the Caritas International's advocacy. I did a 22-country study looking at the Caritas Federation's advocacy in Europe. Their language, in terms of their articulation of what they were doing in terms of a Catholic articulation of the common good, was identical in all 22 countries. But in each country, their strategies and the shape that their organisation and the church took in its strategy was completely isomorphic on the structure of the state in the country, rather than their normative articulation of Catholic theory. So I think you're onto something.
Please, yeah.
Hi. Excuse me, Anel Sheline, PhD candidate of political science at George Washington University. This question may not be entirely fair because it is sort of a big question, but I guess I was wondering about, so if sort of the idea that the premise of the nation state, at its best, would have been to have overcome religious conflict, that it came out of a European context where religious conflict was such that, we needed to create systems that weren't just based on, well, they ended up being based on religious identities, but again, that you'd have a system where it wouldn't matter so much what your religion was, because, so I guess the question therefore is, what does it look like if we did get to a system sort of politically and theoretically where we did overcome sort of the fallacy of the secularization thesis and did acknowledge the primacy of religion? What space is there for kind of overcoming religion, or like if you're acknowledging, that these are very deep and abiding differences, what does it look like then to overcome sort of like a Huntingtonian clash of civilizations, or kind of, or maybe that sort of assumption that, like, well, if we recognize religion, we're going to have conflict, is still based on a very European notion. Sorry, that's not a great question.
If I translate your question, I mean, if we move away from the ignorance or neglect of religion in IR, what is the state of the game now? That's what you're asking?
A little bit, or maybe some of the resistance or sort of the persistence of the secularization thesis is in some ways based on this hesitance, because to fully acknowledge how important religion is maybe looks more conflictual, whereas...
I mean, it depends who you are looking at. If you are looking at policymakers, I would say that the secularization thesis is still pretty strong. I mean, even if we look at the way that we think about democratization outside the West, it's pretty much informed by the secularization thesis. So I would not say it's gone. If you look at the indicators of the World Bank to understand the political development of the world, it's still very much based on the same features. It's not so much that we are moving from no religion to too much religion. It is an ongoing, religion has always been there. That's what Francis was trying to say. So it's just changing the lens as scholars and how we look at it. But we cannot have a normative approach to that. I cannot tell you this is going to look this way. What I know is that there are tons of sites of contestation where religion matters. It doesn't mean that it matters all the time. I would not go the extreme, like we are in a supremacy of religion now, It's a continuous competition, cooperation between what is religion and what is politics, not defined by me as an observer, but what do people claim when they claim religion or politics in these sites? That's all I can say. If you want to.
I mean, from my side of things, I think the problem is when religion is no platformed, that's my big difficulty, really. I don't personally advocate or consider desirable any return to religious dominance. I don't think religion, either as a phenomenon or any individual religion, should be allowed to dominate the marketplace. I don't think that's helpful. So for me, freedom of religion or belief must mean complete religious freedom, irrespective of whatever the state religion is, and that must include the freedom to reject religious belief, but it mustn't include the freedom to exclude religious belief from public debate. So to me, that's what it looks like: the freedom to talk about religion, the freedom to understand religion in any and every context, not the freedom to assert the authority of religion over those who are not religious or from another religion.
I have a slightly different take, which is the presumption that religious boundaries necessarily require either conversion, so the idea of a universal truth, and actually perhaps we might look towards a space in which we can theorize around humanity that the primary principle, and I think this is borrowing from Hannah Arendt, and I recognize how that's not perfect, right? The question is about an unwillingness to tolerate others. And I think, so she was talking about Harold Eichmann, and her argument was that his biggest crime was that he was unwilling to share this world with others. And I think it's about a recognition of sharing this world. And again, to go back to space, when you change the way in which you understand the world, then I think you can start to think about how religions have a shared interest within this world space, as do those without religion. So I think there might be something around that we can think through about sharing. Please.
Paul Lambert here in Georgetown. So this question is mostly for Andrew. In your conclusions, if I read them correctly, while they're briefly up there, one or two of the points you made was about bringing theology to the table when we're talking about political issues. Obviously, going off of what your thesis was there, I'm interested in if you could explain a little bit more on how you see that practically happening. Of course, in the U.S., we have IRFA and so on that has made an attempt to, at least part of it, educate some of our Foreign Service officers on religious issues. I think there's debate on whether that's been very effective. But how do you see us doing that practically, not just in the U.S. context, but in any context, bringing that expertise into to the table on these kind of issues?
Okay. I mean, that's something that the Cadbury Centre in Birmingham was trying to do in the UK context. It's part of our kind of core reason for existence, really. I think my argument would be theologians and biblical scholars have stuff to contribute to the debate, and it's usually assumed that we don't. So the danger is that a kind of secularizing Foreign and Commonwealth Office in our context thinks, yeah, okay, we're dealing with the Iranians, the Iraqis, the Afghanis, etc. But why would we want to talk to somebody who knows about Islamic studies? Let's just talk to somebody about those kind of regions of the world. We'll talk to a Middle Eastern area studies expert. Failing to take account of the fact that religion and culture are not the same thing, that they do have much in common, but they also have distinguishing features, and actually failing to understand that just because there is a particular expectation that Islam works this way or Muslims think this way, doesn't mean all Muslims think that way, doesn't mean all traditions within those faiths respond that way. So what I think a kind of more cursory religious education doesn't always provide is attention to the nuance and the detail. And actually, I certainly don't think that sticking a theologian in the midst of kind of Camp David negotiations is always the way forward. But I think the people who are involved in those decisions and discussions need to be as well informed and well supported as possible. Don't let theologians do it on their own. They need the political scientists, they need the kind of expertise of the diplomatic corps, obviously, yes, but equally it'd be foolish to ignore the expertise that can speak very directly and very specifically into that situation. So I think what we're probably all arguing for in many ways is an interdisciplinary approach to these issues. The distinctive thing of what the Berkley Centre and the Cadbury Centre are both trying to do is bring together various disciplines to address these great issues of kind of peace, global religious conflict, interreligious relations, but from the different specialist expertises that we all bring together. So inclusion as opposed to dominance, once again, I think. Does that help? Does that answer it?
Yes, I'm Alex Wardrop from the UK. I wasn't expecting to see so many people there. I'll just talk loudly. I don't have to use the microphone. I was going to ask something actually about Hannah Arendt and the idea of the polis as a web of communication and social narrative. But actually, I have a more practical question. In the UK, at higher education level, religious education and theology is going, participation rates are going down, departments are closing. How practically do you think the interdisciplinarity of religion can work when the places for learning and pedagogy and thinking of themselves being closed?
Just one comment. At Birmingham, they're going up.
Yeah, so we can be slightly smug about that for a second. I think the kind of approach to religion that is in trouble is this is what some monks in some corner of Germany believed in 1472 kind of thing. Not that that isn't important in its own right, but the impact and the relevance for contemporary society of some of those issues is less than before. Except that what one of our colleagues who's not here today, Nick Adams, is an expert in kind of 19th century German idealism, for instance, and one of the things that he's trying to do is recover how some of those ideas that we do think have been sidelined and that we've moved beyond, actually how reinterpreted and recontextualized can be really crucial in helping us answer some of the questions we're answering today. So I think traditional approaches to theology and religious studies are problematic and are decreasingly of interest. There are ways of understanding religious studies as a discipline that equip it much better for that interdisciplinary approach. So in my usual pitch at Open Days, which I would have been doing tomorrow afternoon if I'd been back in the UK, I usually say to the students, this is a discipline that's more interdisciplinary in its conception than any other subject you could do. There's history, there's literary criticism, there's art history, kind of loads of other things, sociology, anthropology, all those disciplines are part of religious studies. And the more T&R as a discipline gets hold of that and tries to take advantage of those opportunities for interdisciplinarity, it becomes the mother of all disciplines, if you like. It's the universal glue that knits the whole university together. So there's a professor at University of Nottingham called John Milbank who's argued that theology is the kind of core discipline, the central discipline of universities, and should be today as it was in the Middle Ages. I wouldn't agree with him on that, but I think actually religious studies and an appreciation of how religion changes and impacts the sciences, the natural sciences, medicine, the social sciences, all those different areas. I think religious studies is a unique discipline that can hold those things together in many ways, and advocating that kind of approach to doing it seems to be working for us at the moment.
I think rather than thinking about IR doing religion always already, religious studies has been doing international relations or politics in a dormant time, and I think that's a nice way of capturing.
Yeah, it goes both ways, you see. That's, I mean, as much as we need to open up the discussion for scholars of IR on religion and make them aware that there is a wealth of knowledge in religious studies, we have also to make aware the scholars of religion that their own discipline first has not always been reduced to the hermeneutics or the history of religious orders or religious ideas, but that there is a space for them to come and talk to the table. But I think the issue is the lack of common vocabulary today. And we are not here yet. I mean, how do you build, and that's one of what we want to do at the Berkeley, the Cadbury Center, the Berkeley Center is already trying to do. How do you build a common vocabulary for both? And that's what you need both. You cannot do it from one discipline. You really need the cooperation of both at the table. Yes.
Hi, my name is Monica Kraus. I'm a student at American University and Wesley Theological Seminary here in DC. And so, building on that question and what you were saying of interdisciplinary and speaking to scholars of religion about this instead of speaking to scholars of IR about religion, do you have any insight as to how to speak about this to practitioners of religion? I'm studying theological studies at a seminary that is extremely ministry focused. It's all about ordained ministry. And so one of the things that I struggle with is how to speak about these international relations and how this impacts them, not as scholars of religion, but as leaders of religion, and how to speak to ministers who will be leading, congregations that are voting and having opinions about Israel and Palestine. Do you have any insight about that?
Okay. So before I came to Birmingham, I was vice president of a Pentecostal theological college in the UK, and that was exactly the kind of challenge that I faced. Not sure I ever got any good answers, I'm afraid, is the crucial thing. But I think so I started off by saying that society is made up of individuals. I think the same is true in reverse of the church, in a sense. We tend to start in a church context from those individuals coming into relationship with God and that shared relationship building shared community. It's a massive oversimplification, but it'll do for these purposes. And I think there's a model of community arising from that shared relationship with God that can be fed out into the world as well. So one of the deep personal, political and religious convictions that I have is that actually if being a person of faith is in any way meaningful in a wider context, it should mean my commitment to the transformation of society. So as an evangelical Christian, I can believe in kind of the transformational intervention of God in individual people's lives, but I also want to see that in the wider community. And religion is the best motivation for wanting to see that. If you really believe that there is a God in some form who cares about people in some form, then surely he would want to see them prospering and doing well. So social justice is key in that regard. The way we respond to others. So our kind of social ethics is pretty crucial in that regard as well. We shouldn't, as people of faith, just live lives that treat other people with disdain. And actually, I think arising from that individual commitment to living the right kind of life, that hopefully will result in communities that are sharing that kind of commitment, and hopefully even nations that feel, well, this is at the heart of who we are as a people. That's a slightly more confessional answer than you probably expected, but
you change hat in the middle.
yes, switched hat halfway through.
Just having sat in lots of minutes inside the policy community, I don't know what Chris thinks from the State Department, but typical day of a Secretary of State in our system is broken up into 40-minute slots. Religious leader turns up once an hour and a half, wants to have a philosophical conversation, at the end of which there are no solutions. Calling the Secretary of State back to account for biblical or other principles. Please don't. Please prepare your lines. Please have 3 asks. Please have 2 solutions, because he's busy, he's stressed. His wife might have died the night before, or his kid might have been sick on the floor, and you've got to keep his attention. So I think there's a real formation issue there for religious leaders in their ability to communicate upwards into the system, then conversely back into the congregations. I think my experience, particularly of the churches, is that they have a way of building metaphors about the capabilities of policymakers that kind of bestow them with ontological features, like ordained people, like pastors, like whatever. So when they encounter the policy process, they're encountering something which is kind of part of a sustained salvation project, rather than a pretty tough set of priority setting choices with very scarce resources. Now, it's both of those things, but I think we're going to take expectations down here and raise capabilities over there.
I would have a slightly different approach, and that would be to think about the idea of empathetic cooperation. So to recognize and to empathize with your congregations or with others, and to see that in forms of cooperation, but it doesn't necessarily mean agreement, right? So you can empathize, and from a principle of empathy, you can then move forward in a form of cooperation, which doesn't require this kind of assertion of authority or demanding particular ways of being in the world. So you can have that empathetic cooperation. And I also quite like, coming from the field of education, this idea of interstanding, right? So taking the word understanding and generating interstanding, which there's part of my brain that hates it because it's a mashup of the English language and I sometimes really dislike it, but it kind of works. So it's about shared mutual understanding, and also from that recognizing where value is generated within a network or within communication with each other. So there's a lot of emphasis on putting networks together, but actually understanding where different individuals within the network place value. That then enables people from within a mission, from different positions, to empathize, cooperate, and move forward to particular solutions. So they would be the theoretical frames in which I would apply your practical problem.
If there is no more question, we're going to close here. Thank you for coming and thank you for your attention. And we will keep you posted on our continuous interdisciplinary work and dialogue. Thank you very much. Thank you.